I've covered the Battle of Endor many times on this channel, including in the past talking about broad strategies the Empire should have used. Today, we'll be getting specific and looking at the ships and tactics I would have employed had I taken the position of Emperor Palpatine. First, however, let's look at what actually happened. The Empire's strategy was pretty simple. Get a bunch of big ships, including over 30 Star Destroyers, several battle cruisers, and an Executor class Super Star Destroyer, prevent the Rebel Alliance from retreating while using the Death Star to whittle down their forces. Palpatine's ultimate goal was to coax the Rebel fleet into an unwinnable battle and destroy them through sheer power. The Empire, of course, was unsuccessful and ultimately failed for reasons I've covered previously. But it's easy to break down the failures of others. It's more difficult to actually come up with your own solution. So here's the battle strategy and fleet composition that I would use to win the Battle of Endor. A few rules: I won't use any super weapons, special projects, and I'll try to maintain a similar amount of resources or less than those used by the Empire. I will also try to maintain the Emperor's purpose of striking a killing blow against the rebellion. And finally, I'll try to minimize the effect of me knowing what's going to happen, including that the Death Star shield will actually fall. So let's get into the meat of it. The crux of my strategy would be the use of interdictor cruisers. Rather than trying to prevent retreat through sheer pressure, I'd use interdiction technology. Instead of having the Death Star appear totally unprotected as the Emperor did in Return of the Jedi, I would instead have a very small fleet protecting it, primarily 2 ships, which would appear as regular Star Destroyers, but in actuality would be interdictor cruisers. Hopefully, the Rebel fleet would take the bait and attack my paltry defensive force. However, little do they know, the rest of my ships would be waiting in several nearby systems. Once the enemy fleet had gotten within a certain distance, I would activate my Star Destroyer's interdiction field. The interdiction field would serve 2 purposes. First of all, it would prevent the rebels from retreating, at least easily, and second, it would facilitate the use of an advanced maneuver known as the Thrawn Pincer. In Return of the Jedi, the Imperial fleet sort of just meanders in from somewhere, and really, I have no clue how the Rebel Alliance didn't notice them. I would be much more aggressive. The Thrawn Pincer allows for very precise hyperspace jumps, with the interdiction field pulling ships into real space at a predictable point. This is why I mentioned earlier that my ships would be stationed in different systems. By having different incoming hyperspace vectors, 1 or 2 interdiction bubbles can allow you to surround an enemy fleet. In total, I would bring in 3 battle groups, with one slightly larger than the other 2. These battle groups would each include another interdictor cruiser, fully preventing now a rebel retreat. Before I talk about which ships exactly I'd bring in, let's take some notes on general rebel fleet composition. The rebels basically always have the same strategy. They can't afford very many large cruisers, so their strength is almost always propelled by starfighters and small corvettes. The Imperial fleet at Endor, with mostly Star Destroyers and few smaller ships, was very poorly equipped to handle this kind of flexible fighting force. Knowing this, I would focus on a mixed and flexible fleet myself. I would maintain the use of large ships, including dreadnoughts and battle cruisers for heavy hitting, but would support these ships with corvettes and frigates rather than Star Destroyers only. That being said, although I do like the total firepower and capital ship killing ability of dreadnoughts, I think the 19-kilometer long Executor was overkill. Instead, I would utilize 2 sleek and mobile Bellator class Super Star Destroyers, still very powerful, but at 7 kilometers long, the 2 ships combined represent less total assets. The Executor is too large of a target, it's got too much weaponry in one place, and it's not a great match for a very fast rebel force. So as I mentioned earlier, I'd break my forces into 3 battle groups, 2 which I'd qualify as offensive and the 3rd as defensive. The 2 offensive groups would be led by the Bellator and accompanied by a battle cruiser, but would then also be supported by mixed smaller ships. Now, I wouldn't get away from using Star Destroyers because I think they're great for taking down the Mon Calamari cruisers, but I think we can cut the total amount of Star Destroyers in half, let's say about 15, which would be spread amongst the 3 fleets. 15 destroyers would still outgun the Rebel fleet, especially with 2 battle cruisers, several dreadnoughts, and the Death Star. Replacing the 15 Star Destroyers that I took out would be as many corvettes, frigates, and gunships as possible. The large ships would be able to focus pretty much primarily on attacking capital ships, while the smaller ships would operate mostly defensively. Rebel starfighters were a huge issue at the Battle of Endor, and many unprotected Star Destroyers fell to Rebel bombers, including Y-Wings and B-Wings. These corvettes would be great at screening against these attacks, and even though I would have less Star Destroyers, the ones that I do have would be much more effective. My 2 attacking fleets would operate on the far side of the Rebels so that the Death Star could still shoot its super laser. They would pinch the force from both sides while the defensive fleet maintained an active presence around the battle station. Even without knowing what's going to happen, I would not see the Death Star as invincible. Palpatine knew that there was a rebel force on the ground, and I think a competent military commander would know that there is some risk. When fighting in an all-or-nothing battle, there's no reason to get over-aggressive. Be patient, take your time, and be methodical. So my defensive fleet would probably be slightly larger than any one of the offensive fleets, but would be made up of a higher proportion of smaller ships like corvettes and gunships. Speaking of smaller ships, I don't actually care about the specific ship types used, but I like the Nebulon B or the Lancer frigate, basically anything that has a lot of laser cannons. So my actual battle plan I think has a few advantages over that used by the Empire in the canon for a few reasons. Most importantly, we can more easily counter Rebel starfighters, but the Alliance also doesn't have a single target like the Executor that they can take down for a huge morale victory. Sure, they can focus on the Bellators, but the loss of one of those ships doesn't represent the same change in strength. Also, Mon Calamari cruisers are certainly well shielded, but they don't have nearly the same amount of firepower as something like a Star Destroyer. The Alliance largely use starfighters to take out enemy capital ships. So in this scenario, although I have less Star Destroyers, my individual ship should be more effective. It would also be more difficult for the Alliance to move on a single fleet, neutralizing the Star Destroyer's long-range weapons as they did in the canon, because I've got my forces spread out. I think with pressure from 3 sides, I would be able to protect against losses while slowly grinding down the Rebel fleet. But let's talk about risks. I think the major one is that even if I'm winning the battle itself, the Alliance can still destroy the Death Star. All they need is a couple of fighters to break through and make a run on the station itself. Frankly, it's almost impossible to protect the many openings of the Death Star should the shield go down, and unless I have precognition, there's no fail-safe way to protect against a Rebel strike. But I do think my more flexible fleet composition gives the Death Star the best chance possible. The other risk I see is the fleet pushing through one of my 3 forces, defeating the Interdictor cruiser, and jumping away to light speed. I would counter this by protecting my cruisers as much as possible, and should one fall, I would move my extras in to help stop a retreat. I could also use gravity mines as the Hapens did during the Battle of Dathomir, but I don't think that would be necessary. But that's basically it. That's my strategy. One thing I guess I forgot to mention earlier is that I would attempt to cut off the Rebel head almost immediately. We know that the Home 1 was identified as the Rebel flagship. That would be the Death Star 2's very first target. I don't care if I had to lose even an Imperial Star Destroyer in the crossfire. I think that loss would be incredibly demoralizing and would help seal my victory. But that's just my opinion. Do you think my strategy would work? Is Palpatine's actually better? Let me know all of that and more, as well as how you would respond to my actions down in the comment section. Anyway guys, thanks as always for tuning in. This has been EckhartsLadder. May the Force be with you.